When you hear three kingdoms, what comes to mind? Probably epic duels, legendary warriors like Lu Bu or Guan Yu, right? But what if I told you the real war, the one that truly shaped the era, wasn't fought with swords and spears, but with ideas? This wasn't just a scramble for land. It was a three-way fight for the very soul of China, and each kingdom had a completely different blueprint for the future. So let's peel back the layers of the legend and get to the ideologies that were really clashing. So if you've spent hours playing video games like Dynasty Warriors, or you've dived into the epic novel, you probably have a pretty clear picture in your head of who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. But is that picture accurate? Is it really that simple? We're about to find out as we separate the story from the history. And this is the classic setup, isn't it? On one side, you've got Liu Bei's Shu faction, all about benevolence, honor, and fighting to restore the old rightful dynasty. And on the other side, Cao Cao's Wei, portrayed as just ruthless ambition, wanting to tear everything down for their own gain. It's a perfect story of good versus evil. But this simple narrative mostly comes from one single, incredibly powerful source. Yeah, almost everything we think we know about this era comes from this book, the 14th century novel, Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Now, it's an absolute masterpiece of literature, no doubt about it, but we have to remember what it is. It's historical fiction. There's this famous saying about the novel that it's 7 parts fact and 3 parts fiction. And that's a pretty good way to think about it. The author used the real historical events as a skeleton, but then he added, well, a lot of drama. He romanticized his favorite characters, he made events more cinematic, all to tell a really gripping moral story. And that story has a very clear point of view. It was written in the Ming Dynasty, and the author went out of his way to make Liu Bei and his kingdom of Shu the undisputed heroes, the good guys. And to have a good hero, you need a good villain, right? So Cao Cao gets cast as this cunning, cruel tyrant. Real, complex people got turned into simple archetypes, and this pro-Shu, anti-Wei version of the story has basically dominated pop culture for the last 600 years. Okay, so let's push past that cartoon villain image for a second. What was the Kingdom of Wei actually about? What were they trying to do? Their ideology wasn't just ambition. It was a radical, top-to-bottom reform program that was born out of complete and total chaos. This quote right here gets you straight to the heart of Cao Cao's entire philosophy. See, by the end of the Han Dynasty, China was an absolute wreck. There was widespread famine, social breakdown, warlords were watching their own armies starve to death. So Cao Cao's first priority was brutally pragmatic. You have to solve the most basic problems first: food and security. And his masterstroke solution was this: the Tuntian system. He took all these starving refugees and idle soldiers and put them to work on state-run farms. It was brilliant. This one policy solved the food crisis that was crippling all his rivals, and it created the economic powerhouse that let him fund his armies and eventually unify the entire north of China. So when you put all of this together, you get to a pretty radical conclusion. Wei's goal wasn't to just, patch up the crumbling Han Dynasty. No way. Cao Cao looked at the whole system, the corrupt officials, the aristocrats, and he thought, this is broken. It's rotten to the core. His vision was revolutionary. Burn it all down and build something completely new. A state where it doesn't matter who your father was, it only matters what you can do. Now, in complete, total contrast to Wei's revolutionary thinking, the Kingdom of Shu had the exact opposite idea. They weren't trying to build some new world from the ashes. Their entire reason for being was about bringing back the glory of a world that was already gone. Shu's whole ideology was about looking backwards. Liu Bei was a distant relative of the Han emperors, so he could frame his entire war not as a rebellion, but as a loyalist campaign to restore the one true dynasty. Their mission wasn't innovation, it was restoration. They were fighting to take back what they saw as their stolen birthright from usurpers like Cao Cao. This idea of legitimacy, of heritage, was the moral fuel for their whole cause. In their minds, they weren't just another bunch of warlords grabbing for power. No, they were fulfilling a sacred duty to put the rightful imperial family back on the throne and restore its benevolent light over the land. But here's where the image and the reality really clash. The novel paints this picture of Shu's benevolent, virtuous rule. The historical truth? Well, it was a lot grimmer. Shu was the smallest, the weakest, and the most vulnerable of the three kingdoms. It was basically a state that was permanently at war. Their own brilliant strategist, Zhuge Liang, knew that if they ever stopped attacking their much, much bigger neighbor Wei, they'd just get swallowed up. Survival was everything.
And that finally brings us to the third power, the one that often gets a bit overlooked, the kingdom of Wu. Now, Wu was playing a completely different game than the other two. Their vision wasn't about revolution, and it wasn't about restoration. It was all about regional security and the power of family. So think about it. Wei wants to build a new China. Shu wants to restore the old one. Wu's ideology was way more down to earth. Let's just build a strong, independent country right here in the south. And the way to do that was through a network of powerful, local elite families. Their number one goal was stability and security for their own homeland. This slide does a great job of showing what made Wu tick. It wasn't the kind of centralized, top-down state that Wei was trying to be. Power in Wu was built on a really delicate partnership between the ruling Sun family and these other incredibly powerful southern clans. Their strength came from controlling the massive Yangtze River, from their grip on maritime trade, and from a government that was basically run by powerful generals and local bigwigs. So this gets us to the absolute heart of the matter. The whole Three Kingdoms period wasn't just a physical war for land and cities. It was a three-way ideological war for something the Chinese called the Mandate of Heaven, the divine right to rule the land. And this table right here, this just lays it all out so clearly, doesn't it? You can see the DNA of each kingdom, Wei's pragmatic reform, Shu's obsession with restoring the Han, Wu's focus on its own region. It all ties directly back to how they justified their claim to power. Wei got its legitimacy from a, let's say, forced handover from the last Han emperor. Shu's claim was all about its family tree, its imperial blood, and Wu's was a practical claim. Hey, we control this land, we can defend it, so it's ours. Three completely different arguments for who should be in charge. Now, this concept, the Mandate of Heaven, is absolutely crucial to understanding everything. The disasters and chaos at the end of the Han Dynasty were seen as proof that the heavens didn't support the emperor anymore. So each of these three new kingdoms was basically trying to prove, through their actions and their philosophies, that they were the ones who now had heaven's blessing to rule. Okay, so if the real history is this fascinating clash of different political ideas, why do we almost only remember these simple good guys versus bad guys story? How did the fiction end up becoming more powerful, more real than the actual facts? Well, the answer is pretty simple. A good story always wins. The messy truth of political ideologies, economic policies, and statecraft, that's complicated stuff. A romantic story with clear heroes you can cheer for and villains you can hate, that's just way more entertaining and way easier to remember. The novel gives us a human drama, history gives us a political science textbook. And what's really fascinating is that this story we all know wasn't always the main one. This timeline shows how it actually evolved over 1,000 years. Look at this. The earliest historical records from the 3rd century actually considered Wei to be the legitimate winner. It was only much later, with historians and dynasties who saw themselves in Shu's struggle against a northern enemy, that the pro-Shu view started to take over. The novel, when it finally came along, was really just sealing the deal on a story that had been building for centuries. In the end, the reason the legend of the Three Kingdoms is still so powerful today has very little to do with historical accuracy. It's because the story taps into things that are universal. It takes a complex political struggle from nearly 2,000 years ago and turns it into a timeless drama about loyalty, betrayal, ambition, and the fight between our ideals and the harshness of reality. And that really leaves us with one last big question to think about. The story of the Three Kingdoms is such a powerful example of how history is never just a list of things that happened. It's always a story, a narrative that's been shaped by the people telling it. So the next time you hear any story from the past, it's always worth asking yourself, whose version of the story am I really hearing?